Aloha Malapapono, everyone. We're here with Grandmaster Don Crummer of the Kajukenbo system Reyes method, and I brought us Snake Blocker, and he's going to go into some more details here in part 2 of this exclusive interview.
All right.
So Grandmaster, for the viewers out there that aren't familiar with the Kajukenbo background, let's, if you could explain the breakdown of the name and how it became, a compilation of systems to create that name.
Okay, well, originally they said that they had 5 contributors to the beginning of the Kajukenbo system. That would be Cjo Adriano Imperato, Professor Joseph Hoch, Peter Chu, Clarence Chang, and Frank Ordonez. Each one of them had a contributing art to kind of bring into that system. If you break down the name of the Kajukenbo system, the KA stands for hardstyle karate. They say Korean Tang Sudo, but there's some Korean styles that can be mixed in with that. The JU is for Judo and Jiu-Jitsu. The KEN would be for Kempo, that would be under Cjo Imperato. The Judo and Jiu-Jitsu would be under Henry Okozaki and Frank and Joseph Holt. And then the Chinese kickboxing kung fu would be the Bo and the Kajukenbo, and Clarence Chang and Frank Ordonez and Peter Chu would kind of fall into that category because all those guys were boxers back in the old days, and the judo, or excuse me, the Chinese kickboxing, kung fu, and American boxing all came under that Bo. So those that's kind of how the name was developed, Kajukenbo, to kind of bring in all the facets of what they were bringing together post World War II and finding a fighting art in here in Hawaii that could combat against all the influx of Asian arts coming into Hawaii after the Second World War.
And then Grandmaster Reyes is, again, your upline, and can you explain how he integrated his version of that or his applications?
Well, he was a very traditional person, and he liked to make sure that everything that he was taught originally stayed original. And he wanted to make sure that nothing ever got washed down. So as Palama Settlement and the first schools of Kajukenbo was developed, he wrote everything down meticulously on how each technique would work, how each form would be applied, and make sure that within his training, within all of the years that they developed and they grew, that they never changed anything. We always kept to the same basic fundamental. The technique always stayed the same. If we wanted to build on that technique, then we'd add A's and B's and C's to the original technique. But that original technique stayed original, the way it was taught back in Palama Settlement, back in the original time, no matter what. And then if they wanted to branch off from that technique to make it better, then they would just add A's, B's, and C's.
And then the instructors under that same lineage that you work with and train, because you teach, again, based on those notes, are the other ones doing the same thing, or have they hybrided it a little bit more in today's time?
Well, Cjo was really smart in the way he taught all of his high-ranking people. Every instructor, and as a martial arts teacher, you also know that every individual is different, and some people do some things better than some people do others better. So what Cjo did is he looked at that individual instructor and he made him the best that he could make him and taught him the way he thought that he could best portray the Kajukenbo system. So some techniques were different, some techniques weren't. And he just kind of allowed each of these instructors to bring up that system the way it best benefited them and the way that they taught. So like with Alejo Reyes, his whole thing was to keep things original. And with his original black belts, even when he died, his son kept on that same path. All their instructors kept on that same path.
And then question for Master Kylie. You've trained also with not just Grandmaster here, but with some other instructors under the different methods. How was that comparison for you?
Well, as Grandmaster Crummer mentioned, Cjo, the way that he was he really made an effort to cultivate each of his first generation students in their own way. So some of those gentlemen already had a previous background of different fighting methods, and that would influence how they grew. And other ones, it was because of their personality or their occupation would influence how they grew. In my case, my original lineage goes back to Sid Assumption, through my teacher George Iverson to Sid Assumption. Sid Assumption got his black belt from Sijo, but went up through brown with Sijo's brother, Joe Emperado. And after Joe Emperado was tragically killed in a street fight with a knife, since you're a knife man, then Sijo took over Sid Assumption's training and promoted him to black belt. And Sid Assumption was even more about making each one of his students unique. And so if you look at the generation that came out of Sid Assumption, they're very different from each other. You have Al De La Cruz, who was a boxer and also a police officer, and still is. And Sifu Aldo Cascos, who also trained with Bruce Lee, and who in many ways was a massive innovator, very different from Al De La Cruz, Al De La Cruz is a solidly built guy and very wide in stature. Al Cascos, by contrast, is slim and wiry. And then my teacher, George Iverson, also coming out of that generation, was Senior Grandmaster Sixto Ramos and Senior Grandmaster Alan Carter, who's a police officer in Missouri. But my point is that all of these guys, if you look at their Kajukenbo, it's like almost unrecognizable that they had the same teacher, because Sid Assumption was so much about making each person uniquely find their way, and almost like of the philosophy that Bruce Lee would have, that they wouldn't be alike. Whereas Grandmaster Don Crummer's lineage, going back to Grandmaster Chuck Turner and Senior Grandmaster Gary Forbach and Senior Grandmaster Oling Reyes, they're kind of like the gold standard of what was created in the late 40s and early 50s. They're maintaining that flagship, so that they're like a living history of looking at what Kajukenbo was from the very beginning and holding on to that as a touchstone for all of us today to be able to connect to that, which is super valuable. At the same time, it's also valuable in the lineage that I come from, in that ancestry very much encouraged an individual expression and growth, so that a lot of the other branches of Kajukenbo, and there's 4 recognized ones, actually came out of the lineage that I came from. So in other words, together with Sijo Emperado, Senior Grandmaster Al De La Cruz and Senior Grandmaster Aldo Cascos, with Sijo developed the Tung Pai method, which delves into internal Chinese martial arts, healing, Tai Chi, Jingyi Bakua, that type of material, as well as Chinese medicine. And then the Chuan Fa branch, which delves into a more Kung Fu version of Kajukenbo that less resembles the karate aspect. So more Chinese influence in how the different maneuvers are done. So in other words, if a strong karate influence would have a hard block, then in the Chuan Fa, you'd have a soft open hand method, right? Instead of this, you'd have an open hand method. Little subtle changes. You can recognize the original forms, but the stances are more Chinese influence, higher. You can see that contrast. And then One Hop Kwindo, which is Aldo Cascos' unique expression, but he worked with Sijo in getting approval for what he was doing. That started in 1967, around the same time as Bruce Lee formalized Jeet Kune Do. So it's the way of the combined fist instead of the way of the intercepting fist. But in many ways, Aldo Cascos, has a similarity to Bruce Lee in his way of defining his 21 principles that he guides his art on, and that kind of innovation. But here's the thing: Sijo gets credit for a lot of this because he always would say, "Make it better." It's what he said to me as a kid when I was like trying to find my own expression. So in that sense, my brother Grandmaster Don here and I are very different in coming from kind of an opposite spectrum, but through our brotherhood of friendship, meeting in the middle, meaning there's a part of me that was missing that source material, and I was always interested in going back to the roots and learning more about the history and about what it was that our original ancestors in the art did, right? As my Hawaiian Lua teacher, who I'll introduce you to, Dennis Eli, always says, if you don't know your roots, you won't know where you're going. So it's a very Hawaiian perspective of, you have to understand the mo'olelo, you have to understand your ancestry of where your ancestors come from to give you a guide to be able to chart where you're going to be traveling to. So the four original branches are the Kempo Karate, which is personified by Grandmaster Don here, the Tung Pai, which is the internal Chinese martial arts emphasis, Chuan Fa, which is more kind of similar to the hard school Kung Fu that you came from, right? And then the Wanam Kuen-Do, which would be more closer to like a JKD kind of thinking, if you will, within Kajukenbo. And those are the four core branches that were recognized by Shijo during his lifetime. And then after that, it splashes, because within each branch you have different manifestations of unique expression by senior instructors that come up through the ranks.
Great. Well, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Aloha.